I'm Karima Brown. It's Sunday and it's time for The Fix. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold those in power to account. We tell you what matters, how it affects you, and why you should care. The SABC board has suspended for 7 days its controversial retrenchment process amid threats of a news blackout by affected journalists and media staff. The ailing public broadcaster is struggling to make ends meet amid a fundamental cash crisis following years of mismanagement and abuse. It spends over 40% of its budget on staff salaries and is failing to attract sufficient revenue to become self-sustainable. To look at the fallout, I am joined by author of the book Cyril's Choices and former SABC board member John Mattison, as well as the executive director of Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining me. John, let me start with you. As a former board member, what did you make of the deputy board chair, Ms. Mohlala, who spoke publicly and said that she is not in favor of the retrenchment process, and she believes that there are other ways besides retrenchments to look at where the costs can be saved? I read into that this is an attempt to collapse the board. She was meant to be on this program. She had agreed to come on, but she pulled out at the last minute after an emergency meeting of the board last week, Thursday. Do you think that she's been gagged, and do you think that they are now consolidated around this new position?
I don't know the answer to that, Karima, but the thing is that this is a matter where the politicians need to step back. We know that. That's what the Constitution requires. That's what all our history requires. They need to leave it to the SABC to make its decision. I don't know all the people who are on there now, but I can tell you the CEO is an excellent executive. This question of retrenchments came up 2 years ago when I was still on the board, and the politicians came in and interfered. This needs to be negotiated between the executives and the unions. And the unions, I found, funnily enough, were not unreasonable. They were willing to talk. But when the politicians intervene, it creates a mess that it becomes almost impossible to resolve it well.
William, let me bring you in here. The calling in of political heavyweights from Ace Magashule, who is a criminally accused, by the way, to, the EFF and others to come and do battle on behalf of staff at the SABC. Is that a dangerous move, considering the consistent interference that we've seen from various political parties, including the African National Congress, into the editorial management of the SABC's news division?
I mean, it's absolutely fundamentally insane. It is literally like going to a small fire, and instead of taking a fire truck, it's like driving there with a 200-ton fuel tanker and saying, open the taps fully, chaps, and let's see what happens. It is crazy, it's insane, it's unethical, it's also illegal, for them to be inviting direct interference. And it is also precisely why the SABC for the last 15 or so years was in the mess that it was, because time and again you'd get minister after minister and senior official after senior official coming and interfering directly in the affairs of the SABC. The ANC going around telling them what to do, telling them, determining how to run the thing. For the SABC themselves to be inviting that is, I mean, it's staggering. There's obviously no even short-term memory there of what it means to be calling in political officials and the minister and parliament to directly intervene in a process which is following all legal prescripts. It's not as though this is a board that have decided to lock people out or to, let's remember a few years back, to actively censor, to fire, to issue death threats on air, to issue all sorts of things. It's not like any of that's happened. To the best of our knowledge, all of the things that have gone on. Maybe people don't like them, and understandably they're angry. But there's nothing there that has suggested that there's been any illegal action or any action that would even sanction the suggestion of getting a minister or parliament to intervene. It is absolutely crazy.
Now, John, when we talk about political interference, just take us through what the Broadcasting Act says is the role of the board, the executive, and the shareholder, because there's a very crude understanding of approaching the governing party in particular. A lot of people say, no, the governing party is the shareholder. That's why, journalists feel free to tell the Secretary General of the governing party to pick up the phone and call the president and instruct the president to stop the retrenchment process, blurring party and state lines completely, and of course ignoring the legal prescripts of how the SABC must be administered, managed and run on a daily basis.
Well, the ruling party the governing party is certainly not the shareholder. The shareholder is the government. But the Constitution and the laws are pretty clear. This has got to be that the board is appointed to run the broadcaster, and it does, and there must be no political interference. It must be editorially independent, and there are a whole set of regulations and a history that dictate how you do that. When and just to take you back, I mean, 2 years ago, the executive and the board realized that what they were sitting with was commercially unsustainable. And we made a very good start, by the way, when we took over from the board from the Zuma era. The loss was 1.1 billion for the previous year. We cut, in 6 months, the interim board cut it down by 600 million. And then the next steps were, well, how do you start growth? And how do you make sure that runaway costs are contained? And it was at that point that the politicians interfered the first time. It was both in the Thuli House and in the ministry to prevent cost cutting. At the same time, at that time, they were not offering any money. So they forced the SABC into a catch-22. And when I listened to the news this week, the same arguments, the same discussions, the same complaints, the same delaying tactics are all there all over again.
William, let me bring you in here. There was a very seminal court case that was fought. I think you guys brought the action, where the Broadcasting Act trumped the Companies Act to determine and restore the powers of the board as the institution that is responsible for running the SABC. And of course, we've seen successive ANC ministers not quite understanding the difference and why that was so seminal. And here we're also seeing journalists who ought to know better, who ought to be completely au fait with what the Broadcasting Act actually says, calling on, in the desperate bid to stop retrenchments, calling on a political party to usurp the legal authority of the board.
Yes, so in fact it was us, together with SOS and other partners, the Freedom of Expression Institute, that took that action, and we won that. And it's now legal precedent, it's there. It determines that the management of the board are there to run the SABC, and the minister, neither the minister nor Parliament can interfere with the running of the affairs of the SABC. It's that simple. But in addition to that, you also have the very basic element of the SABC's editorial policies, which is that they should not succumb to any level of editorial or commercial interference. And yet here you've got a direct invitation to that again. And I must point out that it's in the middle of what is a legal ordinary process. Section 189 tragically are not unique to the SABC at this point. They've been carried out across a number of media entities, and in fact across a number of other companies. So that's not like the SABC board are doing something that they've never heard of or that's illegal or whatever, because those avenues exist. We've heard that some of the unions have said they will be taking the SABC to court. That they must do. This is how unions operate. This is how the entire process is set up. We've got one of the strongest, most rigorous labour processes, as far as I'm aware, in the world. You've got lots of systems to ensure that things can't go south. And the SABC as management, they need to make sure that these things are done in a manner that is humane and ethical and proper and appropriate and fair and consultative, et cetera, et cetera. So no one's suggesting that that mustn't happen. But for the union to be inviting, direct interference, and for members of the SABC themselves to be inviting that is just extraordinary, and it would set us back so many years to allow and enable that kind of thing. Aside from it being illegal, there's also the African Declaration on the Principles of Human Rights that was published in October 2019, so just over a year ago, and stated in those principles in the African Declaration, again, is the principle that ministers and political figures must not interfere with the running of public broadcasters. So it's not even as though it's just a South African thing, and we've got that legal precedent. It's also coming from an African body.
Absolutely. John, the fact that journalists are feeling comfortable to call in political heavyweights to come and bat for their position vis-a-vis retrenchments, is that an indictment on the management at the SABC? Because in the various interfaces that we've seen with SABC staff and management, people are accusing management of not consulting properly, of not going through the processes, and essentially imposing the Section 189s on staff. We also see institutions like the CCMA and so on being critically under pressure. They can't really fight for workers' rights. Is this a sign of very bad leadership on the side of the management of the SABC?
Karima, I can't speak for what's going on in a board I'm no longer on, but I doubt it. As I say, my experience of I don't know the COO, he came after I left, but I do know the CEO, and he is a very, very experienced, competent, and thoughtful executive. But what I see here, Karima, is a pattern. As far as the journalists are concerned, I mean, the problem is you don't know. There are people still on the staff who come from the Zuma era, the Cloudy era. So I don't know what the motivation of people is, and I don't want to predict that. But what I do want to say is, there's a pattern here that's gone on in the SABC, just as in the other state-owned enterprises, which is the executive have come with a plan, and the government and the politicians have now said, no, you can't do this plan. But when I was on the board, the same thing happened. But then they said, we're not giving you money either. So they put them in a catch-22. So what happens? Months and even years go by where the executive is not allowed to execute. And at the same time, they're not given any alternative solution. And that's what seems to be happening now. The same arguments are being used to delay the cost cutting. I mean, I can't speak to the very specifics of it, but some cost cutting is absolutely essential. And if you don't afford a better solution, how can you interfere with the executives? It's irresponsible and unjustified.
Okay, gentlemen, hold that thought. After the break, we are going to be looking at the financial model of the SABC and what ought to be put on the table. Stay with us.